"You're far too old to play ranch keeper," one of the so-called HOA agents sneered. He said it straight to my father's face as the old man, 93 and shaking but unyielding, stood between them and the excavator aimed at his weathered fence. They waved their forged paperwork like it was gospel, threatening demolition over so-called landscape violations. Dad lifted a trembling finger toward the property marker, but they just laughed. That was their mistake. Moments later, a black SUV screeched into the dusty yard. The driver climbed out silently, slipped on black gloves, raised a phone, and displayed something that froze the entire crew in place. Karina, their ringleader, turned pale the second she met his eyes. From that instant forward, everything changed. And you won't believe what they ended up signing afterward. But first, let me take you back to the beginning. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall pines that lined our family's lakeside land when the call came that upended my world. I'd been living what I thought was a quiet retirement as Henry Castellano, a carpenter turned caretaker of the 15 acres I'd tended for 3 decades. My cabin looked out across Pine Lake, surrounded by outbuildings I had raised with my own hands back when my back was stronger and my grip steadier. But peace, I learned, can be nothing more than the silence before someone decides to tear your life apart. They showed up at exactly 9:47 in the morning, 5 people stepping out of 2 spotless white SUVs. On the surface, they looked like typical HOA representatives: khakis, polo shirts, clipboards. But something about them was wrong. Too coordinated, too polished. Each had an earpiece and identical watches that gleamed in the sun with military precision, not neighborhood bureaucracy. The leader introduced herself as Karen Mitchell, head of the Pine Lake Community Association. She was in her 40s, blonde, and radiated the kind of confidence that comes from never being told number. Her smile was rehearsed, flawless and completely empty. "Mr. Morrison," she said, consulting her clipboard as if it were scripture, "we're here regarding multiple community violations reported over the past 6 months. We have a legal order for immediate remediation." She flashed an official-looking document stamped with seals and signatures. It looked real enough, but when she spoke my name, there was a tiny hesitation as if she'd almost called me something else. My blood chilled. For 30 years I'd lived quietly as Frank Morrison. Never once had anyone slipped. Suddenly the careful identity I'd built felt as fragile as thin ice. I pointed toward the property line markers I'd set decades earlier. "Ma'am, I've lived here since 1993. These buildings stood long before your community existed." Behind her, one of the men whispered into his earpiece, "Target confirmed. Proceed to phase 2. That was no holingo. Karen's smile never faltered, but her eyes gleamed coldly. "Mr. Morrison, age of property doesn't exempt it from compliance. We have reports of structural hazards, environmental issues, and aesthetic concerns lowering values for the entire neighborhood." The excavator roared to life, drowning out my protest. But instead of rolling toward the fence, it turned toward my old barn, the one place I had hoped they would leave untouched. My heart slammed against my ribs. They weren't here for code enforcement. They knew exactly what they wanted. "Not that building," I shouted, dropping the act of feigned confusion. Karen only smiled wider. From her jacket, she produced a weapon shaped like a tranquilizer gun, something no HOA officer should ever carry. That's when I did something I hadn't done in 3 decades. I reached beneath the porch railing and pressed the hidden panic button I'd installed when I first moved here. My stiff fingers struggled, but the small red light blinked once. Signal sent. Karen noticed. Her smile faltered, revealing the predator beneath the mask. Now, Henry," she said, and ice ran through my veins. "Let's not make this harder than it has to be." Then came the engines. A black SUV barreled down the dirt road, 2 more close behind. Dust swirled, forcing the fake HOA crew to retreat a few steps. Relief and dread surged in me at once. My secrets, buried for 30 years, were about to be dragged into the open. The door swung open and out stepped Marcus Morrison, my adopted son, a SWAT officer who thought he was answering his elderly father's call about a property dispute. He scanned the scene with sharp, professional eyes, instantly assessing threats and terrain. My chest tightened with guilt. He had no idea what he was stepping into. "Son," I whispered, though the excavator's roar drowned my words. "They've found me." Marcus moved with the precision of a man trained for tactical entry. Two teammates followed from the other vehicles, automatically taking positions that gave them full crossfire over the yard. They didn't know why Marcus had brought backup for an host bat, but training came first. I watched as my son tried to make sense of it all. The machinery, the clipboard-wielding crew, and his frail father standing like a scarecrow in the middle of a storm. "I'm Marcus Morrison," he called out, his voice firm and commanding, "and I need to know exactly what's going on here. What exactly are you people doing on my father's land?" Marcus demanded. Most people would have flinched when confronted by a SWAT officer, but not Karen. Instead, she smiled calm, confident, like someone holding a trump card. "Morrison," she said slowly, letting the name linger in the air like smoke. Then, with a smirk, "Or should I say a broken bar, the adopted son of Henry Castellano?" The words landed like a punch. I saw my son's composure crack. 30 years of careful lies unraveled before his eyes. His stance wavered, his training fighting against the weight of betrayal as he turned toward me. His face twisted with confusion and maybe even hurt. "Dad," he said carefully, voice edged with disbelief. "What is she talking about?" I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, rehearsed the truth in the quiet of my mind, but I'd never pictured it happening in front of armed mercenaries, heavy machinery, and the looming certainty of death. When the words finally came, they burned like swallowed guilt resurfacing after decades. "My real name is Henry Castellano," I told him, forcing my voice steady. "In 1993, I witnessed Vincent Torino, head of the Torino crime famiglia, order the murder of 3 FBI agents who got too close to his money laundering empire." I watched my son's face as the realization settled in, saw him rewinding through his own memories, re-examining our family history under a harsher light. "I testified against the Torinos," I continued, "put 14 of their people behind bars, brought down an empire that had thrived for 40 years. The FBI gave me a new identity and told me to disappear forever." Karen, of course, was savoring every word. She smiled wider, enjoying the fracture spreading through my family like ice breaking underfoot. Marcus's training saved him, even as the truth tried to crush him. "So this isn't about zoning laws or fences," he said, his hand moving toward his weapon. "This is payback." Karen nodded approvingly, like a teacher pleased with the student's answer. "Exactly. Although I prefer to call it a broken bar unfinished business. Vincent Torino died last week in federal prison, but not before making arrangements, very specific arrangements for people who still needed to be dealt with." She gestured to her crew, who had dropped the HOA charade completely. Their clipboards were gone, replaced by weapons, the real ones. "Your father destroyed everything our organization built," Karen said coldly. "Now it's time to return the favor." The excavator's engine fell silent. In the sudden stillness, I could hear my own pulse pounding in my ears. Karen pulled out her phone, showing Marcus a document that drained the color from his face. "We're not just here for Henry," she said almost casually. "We have a list, 8 other witnesses from that trial, people who thought they could hide behind federal protection. 3 of them were right here in Pine Lake. Can you believe the government actually clustered them together? All it did was make our work easier." Marcus scanned the property, his soldier's eyes mapping escape routes, cover points, and threats instead of the childhood landmarks he once knew. "How many people are you planning to kill?" he asked, his voice too calm, the kind of calm that meant he was already preparing to act. Karen laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Kill? No, Marcus, we're not killers. We're problem solvers. Your father and his friends are going to suffer the kinds of broken bar accidents that happen to old men all the time. Heart attacks, falls, house fires. Tragic, but ordinary." She gestured toward the barn. My stomach dropped. "And of course," she added, "we'll need to remove anything that complicates our story. Like that old building, for instance." "Whatever your father's been hiding in Theory Broken Bar." The barn erupted before she even finished. A fireball tore through the sky, debris raining across the yard. The shockwave knocked me to my knees, my ears ringing with a sound that felt like the end of everything. Karen's crew didn't even flinch. They had planned this. While I'd been distracted by their show, they'd planted charges. 30 years of evidence, documents, tapes, Photographs of everything I'd preserved to ensure the Torino family never rebuilt a broken bar gone in a heartbeat. I collapsed, not from age, but from the unbearable weight of failure. Everything I had fought to protect, gone in smoke. Karen's mocking voice cut through the ringing in my ears. Well, looks like Henry's little insurance policy just went up in flames. What a pity. Now nothing stands in the way of finishing this old business. Marcus was already on his radio, calling for backup, but Karen lifted her phone again, showing him a message that made his jaw clench. All units occupied with higher priority, she read aloud with a smirk. Estimated response time, 45 minutes. She pocketed the phone. Plenty of time for us to work. Then she gestured, and two men stepped out from behind the excavator. They wore sheriff's uniforms. Detectives Williams and Rodriguez, County Sheriff Sophus, Karen announced. They've been very accommodating, making sure we have the space and time we need. My stomach turned cold. Corruption had seeped deeper than I ever dared imagine. The very system that was supposed to shield us had sold us out. Son, I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of decades. It's over. Everything I built to keep you safe, a broken bar, it's all collapsing. The smoke was still rising from the barn when Marcus made the choice that would change our lives forever. He didn't wait for backup. He didn't waste time negotiating. He grabbed my arm with firm urgency. Dad, we're moving. Now, he ordered. His tone carried no doubt, no hesitation, just raw determination. I led him past the smoldering wreckage to an old chicken coop the fire hadn't touched. Hidden beneath was a rusted metal hatch I had prayed never to open. Even after 30 years, the underground vault I'd built in 1995 was intact. Son, I said as we climbed down, the weight of truth pressing harder with every step. I wasn't just hiding from the mob all these years. I was preparing for this. Inside, shelves groaned under the weight of secrets. 47 cassette tapes of recorded Torino conversations, financial ledgers proving money trails back to the early 80s, and photographs documenting murders, bribes, and crimes that never made it into the federal trial. But beyond that, evidence I had gathered quietly for 3 decades. Proof the Torino syndicate had never really died. They had rebuilt from behind bars, using dirty cops and corrupt politicians to weave their power back together. I never stopped, I told Marcus, my voice echoing in the cold underground chamber. I never stopped hunting them. I never stopped investigating them, I confessed, as Marcus stood frozen, staring at the rows of filing cabinets and recording gear that lined the vault walls. Every call, every meeting, every whisper of Torino activity, I logged it all. I knew this day would come, and when it did, I wanted to make sure the whole rotten empire went down with me. Marcus sifted through one of the fresher files of photographs, ledgers, bank statements dated only weeks old. His expression was a mix of disbelief and tactical focus. Dad, he said slowly, you've been running an undercover intel operation for 30 years. I nodded, the weight of decades pressing on me. I had no choice. Witness protection keeps you safe by erasing you, but it also makes you powerless. I couldn't protect you or the others by just hiding. The only way to stay ahead of them was to keep watching, keep gathering, keep preparing. The sound of heavy boots scraping above reminded us Karen and her people weren't going to wait patiently for us to walk out. Then Marcus asked the question I had dreaded for decades. How much of my life has been a lie? I looked at him, the boy I'd raised, the man he'd become. Your mother's death when you were 12, that was real. Your adoption, your education, your choice to become a cop, those were all you. But yes, I shaped the environment around you. I gave you values, training, and a path, because deep down I always knew this day might come. I pulled out a worn folder of records of Marcus's real family history, the circumstances that had brought him into my life. My voice softened. You weren't just a cover, son, you were my reason to survive. Through the vents we could hear Karen's voice, calm and businesslike, directing her crew and the crooked deputies. Marcus, though, was already scanning the vault like it was a war room, mapping strategy in real time. Dad, this evidence can crush them. We just need to get it into the right hands, he said, testing his phone for signal. But first, we have to survive the next 60 minutes. That's when I told him about the others, of the neighbors who weren't really neighbors. 3 more families in Pine Lake are just like us, I explained. Witnesses: the feds relocated here over the last 5 years. Mrs. Rodriguez: she used to handle the books for the Morales cartel. Thompson: he was a hitman for the Chicago outfit before he flipped. The Wilsons saw a murder-for-hire crew in Detroit. All of them disappeared into new lives. Same as me. Marcus's face hardened. So we're not surrounded by helpless retirees. We're surrounded by people who know how to fight. I nodded. We had all tested each other carefully over the years without ever admitting what we really were. This community's been preparing in silence. We've got fallback signals, defensive posts, caches of supplies. The only question is whether 30 years of quiet living has dulled our edge. Above us, Karen's voice sharpened. I could almost hear her planning to smoke us out. Maybe worse. Marcus moved to the vault's secondary exit, a tunnel I'd built into the storm drains decades earlier. His tone was pure command. Then we'll find out. First stop in Mrs. Rodriguez's house. If Karen knows about you, she knows about them. I grabbed the most vital files, and together we slipped into the tunnel. Behind us, metal groaned as Karen's people began forcing the vault door. Time's up, Henry. She shouted down. One way or another, we're finishing this. The passage was narrow and damp, but it carried us away from the smoke and fire. When we emerged behind Mrs. Rodriguez's place, the ground shook with the arrival of 6 black SUVs roaring into Pine Lake. The engines alone announced the fight had officially begun. The door of the lead vehicle swung open, and my blood froze. Tony Torino Jr. A. Vincent's son, 2 decades in federal prison, had turned him harder, sharper, dangerous in ways his father never was. His frame was bulked with survival, his movements coiled with violence. Henry Castellano. His voice rolled across the neighborhood like thunder. My father rotted in a concrete cage for 20 years because of you. He died cursing your name. I swore on his grave I'd make you pie, and today, I keep that promise. This wasn't Karen's neat little scheme anymore. This was about to be war. Marcus reacted instantly, slipping into tactical command. With crisp hand signals, he coordinated with Mrs. Rodriguez, who had appeared on her porch with a military-grade radio, moving with the practiced ease of someone who once ran comms for one of Mexico's most feared cartels. From across the street, Mr. Thompson stepped out. Gone was the quiet retiree I'd known for 5 years. In his hands rested a sniper rifle, and his eyes scanned the battlefield with the cold precision of a man who had once killed for a living. He calculated distances and firing angles with the detached calm of a man who had once killed for money and was now ready to do it again for survival. Across the neighborhood, the Wilsons' teenage son dashed between homes, setting up fallback points and defensive positions with a tactical sharpness that no high school ever taught. Tony Torino hadn't come alone. He had 12 trained men moved with him, spreading out like soldiers. They claimed overlapping lines of fire, controlling the main approaches into Pine Lake. What he couldn't know was that this community had been quietly designed for exactly such a day. Every home had been altered, fortified in subtle ways invisible to an outsider. Mrs. Rodriguez's radio came alive with sharp, steady voices. Families I'd hardly spoken to in years now sounded like units in a coordinated defense. Unit 3 reports Torino's crew advancing on the Thompson house, she relayed, calm as stone. Unit 5 has eyes on the road. Unit 7 prepared to seal the exit. It hit me then our peaceful neighborhood wasn't just a refuge, it was a fortress waiting for its moment. The standoff began when Tony strode into my front yard like it belonged to him, flanked by 2 men scarred by prison yards and battlefields. Henry, he sneered, voice dripping menace. You ruined my family, stripped us of money, land, and respect. For 20 years I've planned how to make you pay. He gestured at the smoking wreck of my barn. Karen thought this could be kept quiet, clean, but this isn't business, this is blood. I stepped into view from Mrs. Rodriguez's porch, feeling the full weight of 93 years but refusing to show weakness. Tony, I said evenly, your father chose violence. I chose to protect my family. If you want to blame someone for his downfall, look in a mirror. That was Marcus's cue. He slipped behind 2 of Tony's men with SWAT precision, disarming them before they even knew he was there. He wasn't just fighting to stay alive, he was defending his family, and a community he was only beginning to see for what it really was. This ends now, Marcus shouted, gun leveled at Tony. You're trespassing on federal witness protection property, endangering civilians, and using explosives. Stand down, and maybe you'll live to face a judge." Tony's laugh was jagged glass. "Kid, you think this is about laws? Number, this is blood and honor. Your father stole a mine, and today I take it back." Gunfire erupted when one of his men tried for a shot on Marcus from behind an excavator. Thompson's rifle cracked once from his upstairs window, dropping the threat instantly. What followed was 15 minutes of relentless, close-quarters combat. Torino's professionals suddenly found themselves outmatched by a neighborhood of seasoned witnesses who had been waiting decades for this test. Mrs. Rodriguez directed units with perfect clarity while firing bursts of cover fire, her skill betraying years of cartel communications work. The Wilson family's home became both armory and triage station, their battlefield medicine saving lives in real time. Marcus moved like a phantom, rallying defenders, intercepting attackers, always with one eye on capturing Tony alive for the information he carried. But Tony Torino Jr. hadn't survived 20 years behind bars by being careless. When he saw his revenge unraveling, he shifted tactics. Karen's voice suddenly boomed from a bullhorn near the ruined barn. "This is Detective Karen Mitchell. All parties lay down your weapons now. Federal backup is 3 minutes away. Anyone still fighting when they arrive will be treated as hostile." But Marcus was already on the radio, and his face went pale at the reply. "All federal units currently occupied on priority operations. Estimated response time, 45 minutes. Karen wasn't stalling for backup, she was buying time for something else, something that would land in less than 3 minutes. Her backup arrived in the form of 4 sheriff's cruisers and a federal marshal's SUV, sirens blaring like they were storming a terror cell instead of a quiet lakeside neighborhood. My stomach sank as the officers fanned out with weapons raised, and not at Tony's men, but at us. "Drop your weapons," bellowed Marshal Johnson through his megaphone. "You are interfering with a federal operation. Anyone resisting will be charged with obstruction and conspiracy." Marcus turned to me, betrayal etched in his eyes. The system he had given his life to was rotten to the core, and Karen had just revealed how deep the rot went. Then Tony Torino did the last thing I expected. Instead of pressing his attack or surrendering, he walked straight up to Marshal Johnson and said something that froze the man in his tracks. "Marshal," Tony announced loud enough for all to hear, "your operation's blown. Karen Mitchell has been playing you, me, and everyone else here." He pulled out his phone, showing Johnson something that drained the color from the marshal's face. In an instant, Johnson was barking fresh orders at his men, but not the ones any of us had anticipated. He moved with the cold precision of a man who had killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again if survival demanded it. The Wilsons' teenage son darted from house to house, directing neighbors into defensive lines and mapping escape routes with a tactical sharpness far beyond his years, his skills that clearly hadn't come from any classroom. Tony Torino had brought a dozen armed men, spreading them across Pine Lake with military discipline, securing choke points and overlapping fields of fire. What Tony didn't realize was that this community had been built and refined for exactly such a moment. Each home had been altered over the decades to hold hidden defensive advantages invisible to outsiders. Mrs. Rodriguez's radio crackled with reports from people I hadn't spoken to in years, and neighbors who, like me, had lived quiet, watchful lives while quietly preparing for the day their past might come calling. "Unit 3, Tony's men moving toward the Thompsons," she reported calmly. "Unit 5 has eyes on the road. Unit 7 blocking the main exit." It struck me then, this wasn't just a retirement community. It was a fortress 30 years in the making. The standoff began when Tony strutted across my lawn like he owned the place, flanked by 2 men whose scars and eyes betrayed hard lessons learned in prison blocks and battlefields. "Henry," he sneered, his voice dripping with menace, "you cost my family everything: of money, power, respect. For 20 years I've dreamed of paying you back." He motioned toward the smoldering wreck of my barn. Karen thought she could keep this business-like, but this isn't business. This is blood. I stepped out from Rodriguez's porch, feeling every one of my 93 years, but determined that he wouldn't see fear in me. "Tony," I said, surprised at the steadiness of my own voice, "your father chose violence over loyalty. I chose to protect my family. If you need someone to blame, look in the mirror." That's when Marcus struck. Using the SWAT training that once made him one of Los Angeles County's best, he flanked two of Tony's men and had them disarmed before they even realized what was happening. But Marcus wasn't just fighting for his life, he was fighting for a family and a community he was only just beginning to grasp. "This ends now," he called, weapon trained squarely on Tony. "You're on federal witness protection property. You've endangered civilians and deployed explosives. Surrender, and maybe you'll live to face trial." Tony's laugh was like shattered glass. "Kid, you think this is about law and order? This is about blood and legacy. Your father destroyed my family's name. Today, I take it back." The first shot rang out when one of Tony's men tried to line Marcus up from behind an excavator, only to be cut down instantly by Mr. Thompson's rifle from a second-story window. What followed was 15 minutes of sheer chaos, an urban battle unlike anything I'd ever seen. Tony's trained killers found themselves outmaneuvered by men and women who'd spent years anticipating this very war. Mrs. Rodriguez coordinated like a battlefield commander, issuing orders while laying down cover fire with chilling precision. The Wilsons had turned their home into both armory and field hospital, patching up wounded neighbors with combat medicine no suburban family should have known. And Marcus, he was everywhere, directing movements, plugging gaps in defense, and still trying to take Tony alive for the intelligence he might hold. But Tony Torino Jr. hadn't survived 2 decades behind bars by being reckless. When he saw his plan unraveling, he made the call that shifted everything. Karen's voice suddenly blared from a bullhorn near the burning barn. "This is Detective Karen Mitchell. All parties drop your weapons. Federal backup is 3 minutes out, and anyone still firing will be treated as hostile." Marcus already had a response on his radio, and what came back drained the color from his face. "All federal units engaged in higher priority operations. ETA, 45 minutes. Karen wasn't stalling for reinforcements. She was buying time for something else. My stomach sank as I looked at my son, the man I'd hoped he would become, and realized 30 years of careful preparation might collapse in the next 3 minutes under a corruption deeper than we'd imagined. Her backup roared in with sirens and flashing lights, 4 sheriff's vehicles and a federal marshal's SUV. But as the uniform spread out with weapons raised, the truth hit me like a blow. They weren't here for Tony and his crew, they were here for us. "Drop your weapons immediately," Marshal Johnson's bullhorn barked. "You are interfering with a federal operation. Resistance will result in charges of obstruction and conspiracy." I caught Marcus's eyes filled with betrayal. The look of a man who'd just discovered the system he'd served was rotted from within. Karen's real plan was finally surfacing. But then Tony did something I never expected, the move that saved us all. Instead of fighting or surrendering, he strode up to Marshal Johnson and spoke loud enough for all to hear. "Marshal, your operation's compromised. Karen Mitchell has been playing you, me, and everyone here." He held up his phone, showing something that drained the color from Johnson's face. Within seconds, the marshal was barking new orders to his men, not at us, and not at Tony. Karen had survived 15 years of balancing loyalties, exploiting weaknesses, and staying one step ahead. Her ruthlessness came out in that final moment as she drew her sidearm with lightning speed, firing twice before Marcus closed the distance. The first round tore into his shoulder, spinning him off balance, but instead of dropping, his forward momentum carried him straight into her. They crashed to the ground, a violent tangle of limbs and steel, wrestling for control of the weapon. Around them, Tony's last remaining men and the crooked deputies froze in disbelief, caught between loyalty to Karen and the sudden realization that the tide had shifted. Their hesitation didn't last long. The thump of helicopter rotors filled the air, and federal agents poured into the scene in full tactical gear, weapons raised, arrest warrants in hand. From the lead chopper stepped Agent Sarah Davis, her presence commanding instant attention. She had spent the past 2 years piecing together Karen's web of corruption as part of a multi-state task force targeting organized crime within law enforcement. Her voice rang out, amplified by a bullhorn that silenced the chaos. "Karen Mitchell, you are under arrest for racketeering, conspiracy, money laundering, obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, and about 50 other charges that guarantee you'll never walk free again." The revelation hit me like a hammer. The insurance I'd been keeping in my notes, My quiet surveillance. The reports I'd submitted hadn't just been for my own protection against the Torino family. They had been feeding directly into Davis's investigation, unknowingly helping dismantle a criminal empire that reached across 3 states. You've been under federal surveillance for months, Davis continued, while her agents fanned out, cuffing the dirty deputies and securing the area with flawless coordination. Your routine reports of unusual visitors, strange maintenance work, and odd communications were crucial. Together, they exposed a corruption network that's been hiding in plain sight. Mrs. Rodriguez confirmed what I already suspected. All our little observations of what we thought of as neighborhood paranoia had been building into a far bigger picture. We hadn't just been watching out for ourselves. We'd been helping expose a rot that threatened witnesses and innocent families far beyond Pine Lake. Even Tony Torino found himself blindsided. He was hauled off in cuffs alongside Karen, but his cooperation with Marshal Johnson had earned him something unexpected, a chance at life instead of an inevitable death sentence. Mr. Torino, Agent Davis said, her tone formal but not without respect, your information on Mitchell's operation has been invaluable. The Justice Department is prepared to offer you a plea deal in return for continued assistance against what remains of these networks. For the first time since he arrived, Tony looked at me without hatred. His voice, heavy with years of inherited grudges, carried across the yard. Henry, a broken bar. Maybe it's time both our families stopped bleeding for the dead. The agents who escorted him away treated him not as a defeated criminal, but as a potential ally in ending something larger than either of us had ever imagined. Meanwhile, the medics swarmed Marcus. His shoulder wound was ugly, but not fatal. Even through the pain, he reached for my hand, his grip firm with his uninjured arm. His voice, though weak, was steady. Broken bar. Now I understand. You weren't hiding from your past. You were preparing for Thesa, for protecting the ones who couldn't protect themselves. In that moment, 30 years of guilt and fear melted away. I saw pride in his eyes, a real pride, not in spite of what I'd done, but because of it. You became everything I hoped you would be, I told him, my voice breaking, not because of the lies I told, but because of who you chose to become despite them. The aftermath uncovered the true scale of Karen's empire. 53 compromised officers across a dozen states, 22 federal officials, and a laundering operation that had funneled over $200 million across 15 years. But what mattered more to us was the realization that we hadn't simply been survivors in hiding, we had been part of the fight all along, unwitting pieces of an intelligence network that finally brought the corruption down. Agent Davis summed it up simply: what you built here wasn't just survival, it's a blueprint, a model for how communities and witness protection can safeguard themselves, instead of depending on systems that can be corrupted. Karen's final words, spit out through clenched teeth as she was shoved into a waiting vehicle, were nothing more than a hollow threat. This won't stop the corruption, Henry. Others will come. They always do. I wasn't the same man who had once hidden from every shadow. I looked around at the people who had stood with me, neighbors, survivors, fighters, and I knew the truth. Let them come, I said. We'll be ready. Before leaving, Agent Davis paused beside me, her tone softening. Mr. Castellano, the Department of Justice would like to bring you on as a consultant for witness protection reform. Your ideas about community-based defense could change everything. It was an honor, but after 3 decades of secrets, I wanted something simpler to finally live openly, surrounded by family and the community I had sworn to protect. Marcus' voice crackled over the radio, faint but steady, assuring us he was stable and already asking when he could get back to help with the cleanup. That single moment told me everything I needed to know about the future. Whatever came next, we would face it together, not as survivors clinging to secrets, but as a family finally strong enough to live in the truth. 6 months after the Pine Lake standoff became a federal case study in organized crime infiltration and witness protection reform, I found myself on the porch of the cabin I'd called home for 30 years. From my seat, I watched Marcus teaching his 8-year-old nephew how to cast a line into the same lake where I'd once dumped evidence bags to keep killers off our trail. The scar on his shoulder had healed, a small but permanent reminder of the day he chose to fight. His transfer to the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force gave him purposeful work that drew from both his training and his years growing up under a shadow he hadn't even known existed. His nephew's concentration as he fumbled with the fishing rod reminded me of Marcus at that same age, back when I was just learning how to be a father to a boy who'd lost everything. Only now, instead of fear, there was continuity, hope, a future. The community had changed too, in ways both quiet and profound. Mrs. Rodriguez turned her knack for communications into a lifeline for newly relocated witnesses, proving that hiding didn't have to mean isolation. Mr. Thompson opened a counseling center for veterans battling PTSD, turning his own haunted past into a source of healing for others. The Wilsons became advocates for reform, helping federal agencies design new protocols to ensure no community would ever be manipulated the way we had been. Even Tony Torino's story had shifted. His testimony dismantled organized crime networks across 7 states, his cooperation earning him 10 years instead of life. The letters he sent us showed a man wrestling with his family's legacy. In his last note, he wrote, "My father taught me honor meant never forgiving an enemy, but after seeing what your community did, I'm starting to believe true honor is about protecting people, not destroying them." He invited me to visit him in prison, and not for closure, but to talk about how cycles of violence could finally be broken. Meanwhile, Marcus worked closely with Agent Davis, helping review witness protection policies. Their research proved what we'd already lived. Witnesses who built connections, instead of being isolated, were stronger, safer, and more likely to succeed. The government offered to designate our community as an official pilot program, with funding and resources. We turned it down. Survival, we'd learned, came from autonomy and from each other. The trials brought headlines, but only briefly. Most reporters chased the scandal, not the human story. Karen was sentenced to 25 years with no parole. She tried to bargain her way down, but prosecutors had more than enough evidence without her. Her final warning that corruption was too deeply rooted to ever be wiped out was met with Judge Harrison's simple reply: "Justice isn't about curing the world. It's about holding people accountable, one case at a time." For me, the greatest transformation was personal. After 3 decades of hiding in plain sight, I'd finally stepped into a kind of visibility, and not the dangerous kind, but the kind that came from being known. I wasn't just the man who disappeared. I was a neighbor, a father, someone who had endured and chosen to use survival as a tool for helping others. Agent Davis' consulting offer never became an official job, but our relationship grew into something like friendship. Sometimes she called for advice, sometimes we just shared coffee and silence. And Marcusa, always pushing me forward, suggested I write our story down. At first, I resisted, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't about entertainment. It was about proof that ordinary people can endure extraordinary trials without losing their humanity. That afternoon, the crunch of tires on gravel broke my reflection. A quick glance at the security feed showed the Henderson family pulling up as the newest arrivals: a whistleblower accountant, a nurse who'd exposed fraud, and their 2 kids, still shell-shocked from leaving everything behind. We'd been helping them understand what we had only learned the hard way: starting over doesn't mean erasing who you are. "Marcus," I called, watching him untangle a fishing line with his nephew. "Looks like the Hendersons are here for Sunday dinner. Think that fish will be enough for everyone?" Marcus grinned, casting back into the water, the sun dancing across the lake like coins scattered in offering. "Dad," he said, his voice steady with conviction, "after everything we've survived, I think we can feed a few more people who need a place to belong." His nephew nodded solemnly beside him, as if already understanding the lesson. It wasn't about the fish, it was about building a home where secrets didn't mean isolation, where survival meant lifting others, and where the past could guide the future without defining it. Because sometimes, the people who seem powerless are simply waiting for the right moment to fight back. And when they do, with patience, preparation, and the courage to stand, no system, no matter how corrupt, can stand against them. If the story reminds you that truth and community can overcome even the darkest forces, subscribe to Toja Stories for more tales of family, redemption, and the fight for justice. Whether you came for the drama or the reports, We're glad you're here. This story was brought to you by neighbors who double-check every gate code, and by a community that knows survival is sweeter when it's shared. Stay vigilant, stay defiant.